Borderbash 2026 is an event happening on the 6th and 7th of June in Albury, Australia. Players can expect 5 rounds of Infinity and Espresso Martinis before lunch, and in this video we'll be going over the scenarios that are being played and diving into how players might choose to approach the event. Now, firstly, and as a quick shout out, big thanks to channel supporter Callum, who made the request for this video. Callum notes that they're attending Borderbash this year, and are looking for a video breaking down the mission pack and some thoughts on each mission. So that's what we'll be doing in this video. We'll be talking about what the scenario pack as a whole demands of players and how you might choose to approach the event at large, and then diving into each of the 5 scenarios being played at Borderbash 2026. Those scenarios are, in order, Superiority, B-Pong, Akial Interference, Cutthroat, and then technically a custom scenario. They'll be playing a lightly modified version of Unmasking, played using Radial deployment rules. I believe the event is 3 rounds on day 1 and 2 rounds on day 2, which does have some effect on how you might choose to approach things. The last round in each day is often the most difficult, so Akial Interference and Unmasking. And in this video, we'll talk through the scoring metrics and how each of these scenarios tends to play, and how to approach playing and winning each scenario from the perspective of both first and second player. Also, just as a note, big thanks to the website infinitygeist.com. All of the maps for this video I've taken from InfinityGeist. I'm not sure how long it's been around now, but it's really cool. It's got scoring tracking, mission rules, it's a really nice accessible UI, and it's frankly a pretty strong competitor for Corvosphere if you're just looking for scenario rules. Now, first, before we jump into the individual scenarios and break each of them down, big question, big wall of text, what is Borderbash asking of its players? What is the overall balance and metagame and list requirement for Borderbash likely to be based on the scenarios that are being played? I would observe that Borderbash's scenario pack is not enormously challenging in any individual sense, but it poses a fairly wide variety of questions to players. Most of the scenarios tend to be active across all 3 rounds of the game, but it's a common theme that the individual demands of any given round in any of these scenarios tends to be relatively modest. You will always have something that you need to do each round, but that something will often not require the entire turn. And what that tends to mean is that these scenarios reward a balance between pursuing those specific scenario objectives and just playing Infinity as a fighting game, inflicting attrition on your opponent, ablating down their ability to damage you back and accomplish the scenario. And one of the things I have found kind of common across a lot of these scenarios is that that really rewards lists that have a good back pocket plan for doing those little things you need to do every single round for each of these scenarios in a way that still leaves plenty of orders and troops and mechanical power free to pivot to aggression. And so I've really been leaning in my preparation for the event toward specialists that are really efficient. So specialists that are just very fast or have tactical awareness or infiltration, things that can just do the mission easily by themselves in a kind of self-sufficient way and leave lots of orders free to then go and kill your opponent. It's not a universal catch-all, but it's a winning combination in a lot of the scenarios for Borderbash, and devoting some time in list construction to thinking about how you're going to balance doing the scenario and attacking your opponent, I think is probably a winning way to approach the event. Now, there are a few specific demands that we need to account for and make sure that our lists can meet. The unique demands is that 2 scenarios use key operators. Now, you do need to have a think about what you can use as a key operator. The requirements in Supremacy are relatively light. Basically, anything can theoretically be a key ops as long as it can survive the game and meets the requirements of the rules. So, not a vehicle, not a remote, not an irregular, never in a marker state. But in Cutthroat, you really do need a key operator who can carry the game on their back a little bit, who benefits from those rules and is dangerous and can score kills themselves, and not every faction has access to pieces like that. In addition, there are 2 other scenarios that make relatively heavy use of classified objectives. Classified can occasionally be a tiebreaker in B-Pong, and Akial Interference is all about classified objectives. And once again, if you can pick a faction where your specialists are also good at doing classified objectives, it can really lighten the load of those scenarios. So if you're still at the point where you're picking a faction or a sectoral, and you're looking to make the event a little bit easier for yourself, two things to consider ahead of list construction are you playing a faction with access to good high quality key ops profiles, and are you playing a faction that's pretty good at getting incidental classified objective coverage into your lists? What I'm saying is play Combined Army. Now, jokes aside about faction selection, as a how-to guide, if you're not sure where to start, you've picked your faction and you want to figure out how to go about writing your lists, actually as an exercise, something I would suggest is to start, watch all this video all the way through, obviously, then hit like, then hit subscribe. But once you have an idea of what these lists demand, I would actually start by writing a list for unmasking. Unmasking is probably the most demanding scenario in terms of how many orders you can expect to have to spend just to do the scenario's objectives, and that's because of the radial deployment in this unmasking mission. And you want to build your list to be thinking about how you're going to quite reliably activate a console and kill a distant high-value target every single round. If your list can do that, then you've probably incidentally written a list that's good for at least 2 or 3 other missions in the pack. You can probably do Superiority by default, you can probably do B-Pong by default, and then depending on what elements you've used, you might also have a reasonable chance of being able to use that list for either Cutthroat or Akial Interference. For Akial Interference, you are going to need to have models that can do classifieds, and for Cutthroat, you're going to need to have a really good quality model that can be a key operator. But if you've built things into your list, for example, that are built to cross significant gaps and kill HVTs, if the models you're using for that meet the definition of models that can be a key operator, well, then that list might be playable in Cutthroat as well. And so figure out where that unmasking list has overlap with the other scenarios. Tweak it if you need to be able to either do Akial or do Cutthroat, and then build your second list to fill those gaps. So if you think your unmasking list can't do Akial, then you build an Akial list. If you think your unmasking list can't do Cutthroat, you build a Cutthroat list. And at that point, you've basically got 2 lists that can play the event. And I would also just note that given the nature of the pack, you could potentially start with any individual scenario and conduct a similar exercise. I think unmasking is the best place to start because it's the most demanding mission, but I actually wrote a dedicated Cutthroat list that I stopped and looked at and went, I think I could play this in every single mission in Borderbash. Now again, that's just combined army things, but it is how I would approach this event. Alright, that is broadly how I would assess the demands of the Borderbash scenario pack on players and how I would approach list construction, with a particular focus on that through line of most scenarios consisting of a little bit of scenario every round and then plenty of having a good scrap. We want to keep that line in mind as we're building lists, but also as we go through each of the individual missions and talk about how they play, which we'll do now. So our first scenario and round 1 is Superiority, which is just a direct action version of the old Supremacy mission. In Superiority, there are 4 quadrants which we are fighting over each round. In terms of points, at the end of each round, we get points for dominating more quadrants than the adversary. You dominate by having more points as a model or a marker state, but not in a null state at the end of the round. 2 objective points per round for dominating more quadrants. There's nothing for ties. You are looking usually to dominate 3 to your opponent's 1, or if you kill everything of your opponents in one quadrant, then 2 to your opponent's 1. You're also trying to hack the consoles. That's just a regular willpower roll in base contact with the console. A console can have been hacked by both players. They don't swap back and forward, and that has an interesting dynamic where what it means is that you just need to have pressed those buttons by the end of the game to have scored those points. You can score up to 3 points for hacking consoles, which is more than an individual round of scoring. Bear that in mind. Finally, at the end of the game, you're looking to have a dominant key ops, that is to say, a key operator in a quadrant that you are dominating. The key operator can't be a regular, a vehicle, or a remote, and can never be in a marker state, and gains dodge +3 and tactical awareness, which are really powerful skills to give to any model that doesn't already have them. Now, in terms of rhythm of play, what this means is that every round your focus will mostly be on making sure that you're making progress on those buttons, but you're fighting over control of those quadrants. You're looking to have more quadrants with more points in them than your opponent, because provided you don't forget about consoles, being the player who scores the dominate more quadrants objective for 2 rounds out of 3 is usually how you will win the game. Now, Let's dive into that. How do you approach that from the perspective of each player? As the first player, superiority needs to be approached attritionally. This is a game where you're going to be fighting a lot. Your path to winning is going to be by killing the opponent's troops while preserving your own, which will naturally put you in a position where you fall ahead in the scoring game because your opponent has fewer points. It's just naturally harder for them to dominate zones because they have less points to put in those zones, and your own aggressive moves will naturally position you to score the forward zones. However, you want to kind of pace yourself here. You don't need to win the game turn one just by the end of turn three. Often that will mean, if you can deliver a knockout punch, go for it, but you should be looking to abrade your opponent's army, slowly reduce their effectiveness and their power, so that you can score more points by the end of the game. Often that'll mean rounds 2 and round 3, you're looking to have the score more, dominate more zones objective. Particularly important to note is that you don't want to overextend, because if you just really push in with everything and you leave a bunch of your troops, say in a far quadrant on turn one hoping to score it, then you have put those troops in a position where they can be counterattacked easily because they're close to all of your opponent's models. They have the most choice and the most order efficiency going after that center of your strength. So pace yourself here. You're looking to wear your opponent down and have more points over the course of the game and score over the course of the game. But because the second player has the scoring advantage in Supremacy, you do need to approach breaking down their army aggressively. You need to play this scenario with violence. As the second player, you have the scoring advantage. So if you're going second in Superiority, then the scoring happens at the end of each of your turns, which means that each round you can see where your opponent's troops are, and you can move, ideally to destroy them, but at least to outscore them. And this can be a really big advantage provided you don't just die to an Alpha Strike. Provided you survive the enemy attack, then you get to allocate your forces really efficiently. If your opponent has like a single 10-point model in one zone, all you need to do is move a single 11-point model to that zone in order to score or to dominate that quadrant and set yourself up for those 2 points. And so especially on round one, sacrificing like a little cheap thing to seize whichever of your opponent's nearest zones are least heavily contested can be an easy way to get a quick scoring lead and set yourself up for a position where you only then need to press some buttons and score more quadrants in one more round to win the game. So look to that advantage. Look to the fact that you only need one more point in a zone to dominate it relative to your opponent, to let you allocate your forces efficiently and score through any attritional disadvantage that you've sustained. If your opponent has hit you really hard and you've taken damage, you might still be able to win because of how you can allocate your troops with the knowledge that the scoring will happen at the end of your round. Now, for both players, you should still pay attention to the consoles, but you only need to have activated 3 consoles by the end of the game, so there isn't really a rush. How I like to approach activating the consoles is to try and do that as part of other activities that I'm pursuing. So for example, if I'm moving a fire team forward to contest a zone or attack, well, I'll just route it past one of the buttons and get that button pressed on the way through. And if I fail a bunch of rolls in a row, don't double back and waste my turn. The button will be there later. The only thing that might change that is if I think my specialists are under threat or I'm about to run out of them. But if I have built Superiority, my list for it, with an eye towards, say, scenarios like Unmasking, I would expect some redundancy of specialists. Similarly, if we're using that list building approach I recommended, where you're looking to have specialists that can kind of self-sufficiently bear the load of the scenario themselves, they're really good in this scenario to just get those buttons pressed whenever you have time. Tactical awareness specialist, infiltrating specialist, they can just be next to a button or get there very easily, just press it, route back to a safe spot, and then try and do that again in subsequent turns. In terms of troops that are really valuable in Superiority, one thing that is well worth trying to put into your list is a little bit of infiltration and forward deployment, or in a pinch, impetuous. One thing that can be easy to miss is that you do need to move troops out of your deployment zone and into the quadrants that you're seeking to score. It's easy to overlook that in the heady rush of pressing buttons and killing your opponent, and especially if you don't put at least something solid in each of your near quadrants, then you give, if you're the second player or the first player, you give your opponent an easy route to try and seize that quadrant. And so the rule of thumb here is that something in every zone, but especially something in your close zones, by default, as part of your deployment plan, is really worthwhile. Even things like 6 or 8 point sashes or libertos give you a model that is just in a zone, so that especially on the first turn, you don't have to spend orders moving into each of those close zones and can focus on attacking or doing scenario objectives. Now, finally, Superiority is the first of two Key Operators missions. I mean, you want a Key Operator who benefits from the Key Op Special rule, Tactical Awareness in particular. And then ideally, you want a Key Operator who is able to survive the game. Now, there's only 1 point resting on that. It is worth pursuing that 1 point. The main benefit of Key Ops here is that you can pick a model to get Tactical Awareness. Now, that's pretty broad. There are many models in the game that can benefit from it. We don't have any other demands of our Key Ops. So a model with a mine dispenser, or even just a specialist you want to go and press buttons, as long as you have a plan for keeping them alive, they can be a good key operator. However, in terms of thinking about what your opponents might pick, I would note that since this is a mission that is going to be paired in the mission pack with Cutthroat, and Cutthroat demands an active, powerful, and violent key operator, you can probably expect to see something like that, and you should probably look in your own lists to picking actually good quality key ops. Now, you won't always have that choice. I've been helping a player write Tartary Army Corps lists recently, and Tartary is really SOL for good key operators, but in Superiority, you can at least pick a Dynamo and just use that tactical awareness order to lay mines and caddy yourself around every round. When it gets to Cutthroat, it's much more difficult, but in Superiority, you've got a bit more flexibility about who your key operator can be. Alright, scenario 2, our next mission, is B-Pong. B-Pong is a scenario where we have 16-inch deployment zones but a 4-inch exclusion zone along the center, which leaves relatively little space for infiltration and forward deployment to use. Although even that little bit of forward positioning can still be valuable, there are 2 consoles and 1 tracking beacon. Over the course of the game, the tracking beacon can move, but as we will talk about, as a general rule, moving the tracking beacon is not enormously important, and you should mostly think of these objectives as being static for most of the game. In terms of scoring, at the end of the game you do get 2 points if the tracking beacon is totally inside the enemy half of the table, but that is the only objective that ever tracks the beacon's location. For the remainder of the game, you're actually looking to just control those objectives along the center line, and you can do that regardless of their location. And that's where the bulk of the scenario's points are. There are a total of 6 objective points up for grabs. You get 1 point per round for controlling the tracking beacon. You control it by being the only player with a model in base contact with it that's not in a null state. And you get 1 point for controlling at least one of the consoles. Now, this can mean that players divide the consoles between themselves, particularly if one of them is really defensible. You'll often jump on that and secure it the entire game. But especially if the consoles are in exposed locations, this can be a very violent fight, trying to control them and seize these pieces. And the tracking beacon is often, not always, but very often, relatively exposed, and it can be moved. Finally, there are 2 classified objectives, and especially in a really close game, those classified objectives can serve something as a tiebreaker. Now, in terms of other scenario special rules, there are 2 tactical support options that can make pressing buttons, etc. a little bit easier, noting that you really don't have to press buttons terribly often in this mission, and of course you can move the tracking beacon. There are a few ways the tracking beacon can be moved. Firstly, a specialist that reaches base contact with the tracking beacon can, once per round, as in once per round per specialist, effectively throw it 4 inches. It's placed completely within 4 inches of its current location. That is enough to get it into the enemy side of the table, especially if it's on the halfway line. And then secondly, you can activate a console. That requires a willpower roll. Successfully activating a console can either nudge the tracking beacon 2 inches, so a small movement, or pull it, magnetize is the word it used, 6 inches back toward the table line. It can't cross the central line that way, so you would realistically only use that if your opponent had moved it a long way, and in my experience there's very little benefit to moving it a long way early in the game. The reason for that is that it's just harder to control the tracking beacon each round if it's all the way over on your opponent's side of the table. And so with that in mind, okay, well, how does B-Pong play? Let's dive into this. And the main thing, as I noted, is that it's easy to assume that moving the tracking beacon is important, but it's really not. There is no need to do so until round 3, and you can absolutely win B-Pong without ever moving the tracking beacon. In fact, the bulk of the scenario's points are just for controlling the beacon and the console each round. And so if you try and get ahead of yourself and you go, aha, I'd like those 2 points for having the B-Pong in my opponent's half of the table, and you fling it into your opponent's half of the table, you've probably just made it much harder for yourself to hold over the course of the game. It's usually better to leave it where it is, and it can occasionally even be worthwhile moving it back to your side of the table, literally throwing it back towards your troopers to make it easier to seize each round. This is something, for example, that the first player might consider doing. If that 4-inch movement with a single specialist puts it in a really defensible position. Because going first in this scenario is really difficult. This is probably the most second player favored mission, because most of the points are end of round scoring, and the location you have to put troops to score tends to leave them exposed. Often, if you win the role and you pick deployment zone, for example, you will be picking deployment zone based on having nice, easy access to one console and torturous access for your opponent to another, for example. And that can make scoring for the first player really difficult and preventing scoring for the second player really easy. So if you are going first in B-Pong, you need a plan to really aggressively secure that space to control those objectives every round. There are a bunch of different ways you can do that. You can do that by attacking, you can do that by having really strong AROs to prevent your opponent from moving forward, you can do that by throwing material out into the midfield, so deployable repeaters and mines, etc., that your opponent has to push through, or you can do it by just trying to punch your enemy so hard that they don't have a way to counterattack and dislodge you from those vulnerable central objectives. And so, if you can, you really want to have a plan to kind of button up the midfield and keep it under your control, or just land a knockout blow kind of early. If you can't, you need to exercise some patience. Try and just lock down one of the consoles to keep the score from getting too far ahead in your opponent's favor. If you're going first, you want to at least score 1 point every round for securing one of the two objectives, either a console or the B-Pong itself, the beacon technically, just so you get that 1 point to your opponent's 2 and have a little bit of breathing room. If you have like 2 turns in a row where your opponent scores 2 and you don't score any, recovering in the end game is technically possible but really difficult. As the second player, you've got the scoring advantage. You get to see where your opponent has positioned their troops and then respond accordingly, and because they have to put their troops almost on the halfway line of the table, that often means if you've got some decent offensive pieces, you can just go after and kill those pieces your opponent has, holding the midfield. And at that point, you can use your own troopers. Often you'll just use cheap disposable troopers, which is not a luxury the first player has, to secure objectives. Your opponent has to put pieces, if you're, but the person who's going first in B-Pong has to put pieces on the objectives that can survive there to score. The person who is going second doesn't. They can focus on killing whatever their opponent extends, pulling back and keeping their own active and powerful pieces safe, and then just put little 5-point shitters, war correspondents, sashes, whatever, on those midfield objectives, knowing that yes, your opponent might kill them, but that's a very sustainable material loss. And you can use that to kind of flip the script on the attritional advantage. Usually the first player has a bit of an attrition advantage in Infinity because they get to throw the first punch. They can upbraid their opponent's forces, they can kill their opponent's pieces. Those pieces now won't generate orders for the rest of the game, which means that the second player has fewer orders to counterattack with. It's a whole dynamic that many scenarios work around balancing. But in B-Pong, because your opponent has to leave often quite valuable things in the midfield right from your first turn, you can really shave away powerful or useful elements from your opponent and use that to recover an attrition lead. If your opponent chooses to only use disposable troops to contest the objectives, which frankly they might for exactly this reason, those disposable troops are often easier for you to kill. And so, as second player, while absolutely you do have to defend successfully and survive your opponent's attacks, if you do, you can really ruthlessly use the scoring advantage to put your opponent under even more pressure and force them to extend even further. And as a result, my advice for B-Pong actually is that, so this is the most second player favored scenario I find in the mission pack, and it's probably really worth focusing your practice on as a result. Because it is round 2, a lot of players are unlikely to have fully found their level in Swiss pairings at that point. And so we're still in that part of the event where there's a little bit of likely skill discrepancy between opponents. Not massive, everyone going I expect is pretty good at Infinity. But the matchups on a skill basis are a little bit less likely to be close. And what that means is if you think, in your own opinion, you get lucky in round one and are potentially playing up into a veteran, or you get unlucky in round one and you're playing down into someone that under normal circumstances you would beat, a bad lieutenant roll in B-Pong has the potential to disrupt that unless you practice. An inexperienced player that has still put a lot of practice into playing B-Pong might be able to secure one more win than they otherwise expect, and an experienced player who perhaps loses the lieutenant role, is forced to go first and isn't ready for it, might kind of just lose the game off the back of that if they haven't practiced. So B-Pong is a scenario to kind of focus your practice on a little bit, and in particular, practice playing both going first and going second. Because if you don't have a comfortable position in terms of experience for each of those options, running into whichever you're not used to could cause you to come a cropper. So focus your practice, not necessarily your list construction, but focus your practice a little bit on B-Pong and just get comfortable with playing as both first and second player. Now, our third scenario, the final round on day 3, is Akial Interference. And in some respects, Akial Interference is quite different from all the other scenarios, and in some respects, actually, it has a lot of these elements I've been talking about in terms of how the scenario broadly plays. Now, objective-wise, Akial Interference is mostly all about classified objectives. And just before we get into how you score objective points, let's just talk a little bit about how objectives are picked for this scenario. At the beginning of the game, after deployment, each player will draw 2 classifieds from their deck. They will pick one to be their private classified, and they'll put the other one into the center of the table where it will become one of 2 common classifieds that both players can accomplish. In round 1, this tends to mean you have one good classified in your hand, and you've often put one really shit one into the middle of the table that neither player wants to do. From that point onwards, on rounds 2 and rounds 3, all classifieds are cleared away from the middle. The common classifieds get rotated out, and 2 new common classifieds get chosen, but those are chosen by the same draw 2 pick 1 method. You don't get a new private classifier, you just pick one of 2 classifieds to put into the center. And that means you've got a fair bit of agency at that choice. You want to be picking scenarios that are easy for you to do, but also ones that are hard for your opponent to do based on the troops that they've got left alive. Now, from those private and common classifieds, we get our scoring. You get 1 point for each common classified you've done to a maximum of 6. I have seen players accomplish 6 classifieds, but I wouldn't rush to go and do that. It's not necessarily how the mission is won. You're looking to get more classifieds than your opponent. That's 1 objective point, and that counts both common and private. So it's 1 point per common classified, and then 1 point for more classifieds total. And oops, just noted an error in the slide, which I've corrected. 2 points for doing your private classified. So 1 point per common, 2 points for the private, 1 point for doing more in total. Finally, at the end of the game, you want to have accomplished at least 1 classified objective each game round, even if it subsequently gets cancelled. What's that mean? Talk about it in a second. 1 objective point for doing that. And I would note that while normally single point objectives like this kind of just serve as signposts so you don't need to focus on them, Akial Interference is a scenario that kind of naturally lends itself to wanting to get that 1 classified objective each game round. We'll talk about that as we dive into the mission. Now, I've talked about how private and common classifieds are selected. Let's talk about the antenna in the midfield. It can do 2 things. It can emit interference or filter the signal. Filtering the signal does not require a roll, and it just causes 1 common classified objective to be discarded. If it's been scored, cool. Whichever players scored it still count as having scored it, and it gets replaced by a random draw off the top of your classified deck. You can filter the signal multiple times in a row, not requiring a roll each time, but the draw is random. So you need to kind of think about it as, oh, I might budget 1 or 2 orders for this, but it's almost like having to do a whip roll anyway because it's functionally random each time you draw the card. So if you get something that you just can't do, you'll need to filter the signal again to get a classified that you can. Emitting Akial Interference is actually a quite important part of the scenario. That requires a willpower roll, and what it does is it cancels a classified that your opponent has done that matches a symbol of a classified that you have done. Now that classified does still count for the 1 objective point for having accomplished a classified each round, but it no longer counts in terms of the points for common classified objectives. You can only Akial interfere with common classified objectives, and it no longer counts for having accomplished more. So you can really swing the game by using emit Akial interference to cancel classifieds your opponents have done whose symbols match yours. And this can also be particularly important because if you get in first, right, the precondition for emitting interference is that you both have a classified with the same symbol. If you get in first and you cancel that symbol, well, now your opponent doesn't count as having accomplished that classified and so can't interfere with you back. So you kind of lock in victory points that way. And so making runs on the antenna to emit interference at kind of your earliest convenience can be a very important way of winning the game. Now, how does Akial Interference play in my experience? I would say this is a scenario that is kind of easy to mistake for a mission like Highly Classified that demands maximum classified coverage. You want to be able to have redundancy in your list. You want to be able to do quite a lot of classifieds and be able to do them reliably, but it's actually relatively relaxed in terms of needing maximal coverage. You do not need to be able to accomplish every single classified in the deck to be able to accomplish Akial Interference. It's actually quite possible to do this mission without having access, say, to doctors or engineers or hackers, although hackers are a really good one because they cover a lot of classifieds. And so you don't necessarily want to over-compromise your list, particularly in terms of your ability to sustain and dish out a punch. Your main goal should be to accomplish at least one classified objective every round, usually doing your private classified objective on round one because it's worth more points, can't be cancelled, and is one of the easiest ones to do because you'll have picked it from two. Once you've done that one classified every round, you then kind of have a lot of choice about how each round plays out. And this is one of the reasons why Akial Interference is really interesting to me, because theoretically a player could pursue 6 objectives in one turn. That is technically possible. They just need to be camping the central button, pressing it multiple times, and doing whatever random classified drops every single time. But what this creates is a dynamic where there are sort of diminishing returns. There are 2 common classified objectives and 1 private at the very beginning of the game. And trying to do more than the classifieds that start in play at the beginning of each round requires proportionally more orders because you need to filter the signal till you get one that you can do and then pivot to doing that for every one after the ones that are available initially. And this creates a kind of rubber banding effect where trying to really aggressively pursue the scenario, particularly pursue it a lot on one turn, has diminishing returns. And it's also why I think that signpost objective of try and do one classified objective every round actually is really worth following, because that's usually the most efficient way just to get points scored without overextending or leaving your opponent completely safe from aggression. In general, provided you can do at least one of the classifieds that is there in the midfield as a common classified objective at the beginning of each round, usually you want to do it and then kind of just figure out what the best thing to do is afterwards. It might be more mission play, but it could also be attacking your opponent and killing their specialist and depleting their order pool. So don't be afraid to switch gears in Akial Interference and play it as a little bit of scenario every round and otherwise degrade your opponent's forces. Now, as first player, you've got the initiative in Akial Interference. You get to launch the first attack, you get to put up your midfield defenses if you've got things like mine dispensers, etc., and generally dictate the pace and nature of play in the game. If you draw a private classified you can do easily, you will usually do it in round one. And then personally, I like to use as many spare orders as I can in round one to put the boot in, particularly focusing on enemy models that can do classifieds because killing them really tends to make your opponent have to work harder for the rest of the game. As the second player, you have to weather that attrition, but you do have the advantage of having the best window to cancel enemy classified objectives. And what I mean by this is if your opponent accomplishes a common classified objective in their turn, and then you accomplish it early in your turn, there is a window there where you can go and cancel it in your turn in the same turn that you accomplish it. And your opponent does not have that window. Say you go into your first turn or your second turn with 10 orders and it takes 2 of them or 3 of them to accomplish a common classified objective that the first player also did, you can use those remaining 7 orders to make a run to the central button and then activate it to emit Akial Interference and cancel that same common classified from your opponent's perspective before they have a chance to do anything. By comparison, the first player has to wait until you finish your turn and they begin their turn before they have that same window to go to the central objective and try and emit interference to cancel the common classified. And if as second player you get in first, they no longer count as having accomplished it and so can't cancel your version of that card. Now, that's not an enormous advantage, but it is an advantage. It's something you can leverage, it's asymmetric, and it can be decisive if you've got the orders to pursue it. The only other advantage as second player that you have, and I didn't note it here, but just as I'm talking, you're deploying 4 HVTs in Akial Interference, and there aren't really any restrictions on how close or how far apart they can be. In scenarios where you're deploying multiple HVTs, the first player is almost always taking a little bit of a risk if they clump them together. Not always, sometimes there's just a best spot to put them. But because the first player deploys first, the second player will be able to see where a clump of classified targets is and kind of deploy accordingly with a little bit of forward thinking about what might come out of the deck. As the second player, you're often a little bit safer clumping your HVTs together because your opponent will have deployed probably along a broader front, or you'll see where their pieces that might interact with HVTs are. And you want to particularly think here about interactions that require getting into line of sight or base contact with the HVTs and deploy your HVTs away from enemy troopers that could do those objectives. That can be a small advantage for the second player. Now, final pieces of advice for both players is when you're choosing your classifieds, right? Turns 2 and turns 3 especially, don't underestimate the power of the hate draft. One of the things that you will probably do, and you should be doing ideally, is that you'll get your 2 classifieds and you'll go, which of these can I do? That's very important to think about. But equally important is to think about what your opponent can't do. And so, for example, if you've killed all of your opponent's hackers, then something like, say, HVTs, maybe say you draw Sabotage and HVT Data Scan, and you can do Sabotage really easily, but so can your opponent. You can do Data Scan maybe a little bit difficult, but your opponent can't do it at all. Data Scan is probably the better choice there in terms of getting ahead on the scenario. The ideal classified is one that your opponent can't accomplish at all and you can do easily, but you will often want to settle for one that your opponent can't do at all and you can do with some effort. Finally, just as a note generally about how to think about the scenario, and this was something I observed with countermeasures. People had this tendency to think of countermeasures as luck-based when it really wasn't, and Akial Interference is kind of the same. Yes, you have to draw cards as part of Akial Interference, which inherently involves a little bit of randomness. But if your list is built properly, it should always be able to do something productive. And I don't mean productive in the sense of do classifieds at the exclusion of everything else. Even if you can't do a classified in a particular round, it may still be a winning play to kill the enemy, knock out their important pieces, and set up to do classifieds next turn. A turn of terrible classifieds can still be turned to your advantage. You have all of the same resources to play with, so don't focus too aggressively, like mentally, on good or bad luck of the cards. It's a game of two halves. Those things tend to equal out. How you spend your orders and how you use your forces is much more important to winning Akial than good or bad luck with the card deck. In short, I don't want to hear a single after-action report in Akial Interference that complains about card draws, because that is not what wins or loses this mission. Now, Akial was the end of day 1. We begin day 2 with another extreme scenario in this event pack, the most violent scenario, Cutthroat. Cutthroat is all about killing. That's it, that's how you score objective points. Now, not without some nuance, it's not annihilation, but it is a very violent scenario. You get 3 objective points for just killing more army points than your opponent. You get 3 objective points for killing more lieutenants, or 1 if you've each killed at least 1 and have the same number. 1 objective point for killing the enemy key operator, and then 3 objective points for killing more enemy troops with your key operator than the enemy does with theirs. Reinforced Tactical Link applies to this scenario, which means that the lieutenant is always public information, but you can never be in loss of lieutenant. And unsurprisingly, there is no retreat in this scenario. We've got 16-inch deployment zones, and no exclusion zone or any other deployment weirdness. And it especially because of those 3 objective points, or kind of 4 objective points that relate to the key operator. 1 point for killing the enemy key operator, and therefore 1 point you deny the opponent if yours survives, and 3 points for killing more enemy troops with your key ops than the enemy does with theirs. This scenario is why I really called out having access to good key operators being something you might consider when selecting your faction because of this scenario. A good key operator, a really high quality one that really benefits from the tactical awareness and the dodge +3, but who is also dangerous and durable, really matters in Cutthroat. In Superiority, we can get away with a utility, maybe a specialist or a model with a mine dispenser or some other deployables. We can have a soft key operator in Superiority and have it not really badly sabotage us. In Cutthroat, you need a kill piece. You need a durable kill piece. Can't be a vehicle, can't be a remote, can't be irregular, can't be in a marker state. And so if your faction does not have access to pieces like that, you might really need to build a list for Cutthroat to try and accommodate that weakness. If you do have access to pieces like that, and there are some factions who have just tremendous elements. Combined Army, for example, probably has 3 of the top 10 Cutthroat key operators in the game. Pan-Oceania has some fantastic ones, especially if you're comfortable not benefiting from tactical awareness. You can pick a tag, fill your boots. And some tags don't have tactical awareness, and so fantastic. If you're playing O12 and you have a Zeta is an excellent choice, although it can be kind of risky. You have to consider, hey, do I run the Zeta as my lieutenant? Well, a lot of points are riding on that thing living, but if it does, you probably win the game. And so a aggressive, powerful, and durable key operator really should be a core consideration when building your list for this scenario. Now, analysis of Cutthroat, because it's not just Annihilation. It is the closest scenario to Annihilation, and it's the one that's most likely to be decided by an Alpha Strike, but kind of paradoxically, this makes defense really important. And one thing I would call out as a potential successful list archetype for this mission is to build a list with an eye toward extreme defense. The reason being, your opponent is almost always going to choose first turn if they win the roll, and if you win the role, you can just pick deployment, which lets you lean into your strengths. A really strong TAC defensive list, a really strong Varuna defensive list, those kind of archetypes can be a nightmare for a player who has planned on blowing out their opponent on the first turn, and there is very much that potential for them to break their risk trying to throw that punch, which can let you win the game off of the back of defense. Now, as the first player, you get the first swing, and you really want to build your list for an Alpha Strike here. You hit hard, you hit fast, you have no mercy. A strong play, and one that has won me many games of Cutthroat, is to use your key operator to score some kills on the path forward and zero in on killing the enemy key operator. You only need to get 1-2 kills with your key ops and kill the enemy key ops on the first turn. And remember, the enemy key ops can never be in a marker state, so they are always vulnerable, and you've just locked in 3 or 4 points out the gate. If your lieutenant is durable in this scenario, for example, your lieutenant is under a marker state, or is just really tough, you've probably just forced a draw right there, because your opponent, if they can't score more lieutenant kills, and you've just scored more kills with your key ops, even if they get more army point kills, that's not a winning player. So as first player, really go for the Alpha Strike, but especially kill the enemy key operator on the first turn. Might be easier said than done. Might mean you're trying to kill Achilles, who is dodging on 18s or just shooting you with his plasma rifle, but if you can, kill the enemy key ops. As the second player, you gotta just white knuckle through. You gotta just survive that first turn. You gotta keep your key operator alive. They're the only trooper in your list that can't be replaced. Technically, any other loss might be sustainable. Even your lieutenant. Remember, there's no loss of lieutenant in this scenario. But you gotta just knuckle down and defend. Your only real advantage as second player in this scenario is that you will go into the final round knowing what risks you have to take, and that really should be a moment to pause for breath. If you're player 2 and you haven't just won the game off the back of like a really strong defense or something, on your final turn, do a stock take. Think about how you might possibly win the game. Firstly, how do the army points sit? Are they close? Are you ahead? If you're ahead, maybe you just do nothing on your final turn. If you're behind, how much do you need to kill? If it's really close, what are you risking by pushing your force troopers forward, and how can you do so judiciously? Where do you stand on lieutenant points? Where do you stand on the key operators? Basically, what has to be killed and only has, like, what is the absolute minimum that you need to do without risk? What are your paths to victory and what are your paths to defeat? Because I have seen players lose Cutthroat thinking they had to keep pushing as player 2 when actually maybe they needed to get just one safe kill to get ahead on army points and then call the game there. Be judicious as the second player on your final turn because it is your only window of advantage. Now, finally, in terms of play considerations and list construction, lieutenants can be a really valuable thing to think about as well. I tend to be quite blasé with my lieutenants just generally. I'm very willing to risk loss of lieutenant as a player, but this is a scenario where especially a marker state lieutenant can be a worthwhile investment. That's a level of insulation that makes you immune to certain kinds of attacks and can make you just a little bit too difficult to kill. And the corollary of that is, even if your opponent has a nominally vulnerable lieutenant, you need to be careful trying to dive that. Because if you overextend seeking to get a lieutenant kill, and you lose a bunch of troops doing so, or you spend a bunch of orders, and all you kill is a lieutenant, well, cool, you're now one up on the lieutenant kill chain. But if you had half of your arm chopped off getting that kill, your opponent now potentially has multiple rounds to get well ahead on army points and establish a situation where for them, investing the orders and making the extension to get the kill on your lieutenants is easier. So be judicious with lieutenant assassinations, can be very worthwhile, just weigh the cost because there are both army points and lieutenant kills and key operator kills, all of those things are important. You do not necessarily win the game by killing an enemy lieutenant on turn 1. Reinforced Tactical Link will kick in, and there's a lot of game left to play. Kind of think more attritionally. And just as a final note, and I'm probably going to regret, or other people will regret saying that, me saying this a little bit, but there is an alternate line of play you can pursue in Cutthroat with some armies. If you want a really toxic way to play this mission, find a key operator with good quality speculative fire or guided fire. Two things that leap out to me are the Hayate in White Banner or the Squalos. If you have access to that kind of a troop, you can just build a list that is defensive as possible and you just shell your opponent into the ground. You just spec fire high value things forever or guided fire high value things forever, knowing that in doing so you are ticking up that kill count on your key operator. I think perhaps probably the most miserable possible play experience someone can have in Cutthroat is against a Varuna player that is built like 90% for defense. Like all of the things in Varuna that are a real pain in the ass. Jammers, a lieutenant under a marker state, multiple helots, good quality ARO pieces, and then their opponent just spends 11 orders a turn washing spec fire through a Squalos grenade launcher and gets like, I don't know, 2 or 3 kills a round, maybe? But there is no response to that. It's completely non-interactive, and every one of those kills ticks up that kill counter on the key operator, who is just as safe as houses as far back as possible. Yeah, that sounds absolutely terrible to me. And if someone has that play experience, I want to hear about it, and how the other player handled that, and if they were able to play through. Now, finally, Mission 5, the only technically custom mission in the pack, Radial Unmasking. In this mission, we have 24-inch radial deployments, and 3, it says tech coffins because I had to use the provisioning map for this, but 3 objectives, consoles along the center line, 1 in the middle of the table, and the others 16 inches out along that diagonal. Each player also places 3 HVTs. They begin the game unrevealed and will be revealed to be able to be attacked over the course of the game, secretly noting which 2 are decoys and which is the real designated target. You will note I have also marked out the unofficial HVT zone on this map. There can actually be a lot of places you can put HVTs. In this scenario, you can really spread them wide apart because of the radial deployment. But because the preceding 4 rounds will all have been played on regular 12-inch, 16-inch deployment zones, you should almost always be able to find at least some good spaces for HVTs inside that unofficial HVT zone. Now, how do we score points in this scenario? Well, just talking about the consoles first. You can activate a console. It requires a willpower roll. Operational learning applies, so you can repeat the roll if you fail for successive bonuses. And as soon as you succeed, that console flips to your control and you get to nominate an enemy HVT to reveal. The enemy then tells you, is it a decoy or is it the real designated target? Regardless, at that point onwards, it can now be attacked. Once you've activated a console, you can't activate it again unless your opponent flips it to their control, at which point you can flip it back and forth, each time revealing a HVT. So, how do we get points? 3 points for killing the real designated target. Remember, you have to reveal it in order to attack it. 1 point for killing a decoy HVT, but again, you have to have revealed them first. 1 point for killing more target decoys than the adversary. So that's kind of the bulk of the points. It's about going after and killing these targets with a maximum of 6 points on the table if you kill everything and your opponent doesn't get as many target decoys as you. Then you get 2 points for having more activated consoles than the adversary at the end of the game, and 2 points if your designated target isn't killed. Of all of those, pay particular attention to the activated console, because if both players are able to go after and kill all of the targets, that is what will decide the game. The best line of play, of course, is to be able to defend your designated targets and keep your opponent from killing them, but if that's not possible, consoles are how you will win. Now, how does Radial Unmasking play? The first thing I want to kind of just mention, at the very beginning of this video, I said this was the most order intensive, and it is, although it might even be more accurate to describe it as movement intensive. There is a ton of distance that you have to cover in this scenario. Because it is a radial deployment, there is a lot more midfield, there is a much longer diagonal axis that players can spread out across than there would be in a regular table edge deployment, and this means you have to cover lots of distance. The consoles are widely spaced, the HVTs will be a very long way away or spread out or both. And so all of that movement that everyone's factions kind of got in N5, almost everyone's factions, is being really tested here. 6-2 move will only get you so far. You have to have a plan for getting around the table. When you're deploying your HVTs, look for defensible positions ideally close to the table edge. So good cover, which will particularly often exist where your deployment zone would have been in a normal 12-inch deployment. That unofficial HVT zone that I mentioned, people will have put their tables together in a way where models in those positions are defended from the enemy deployment zone. That's how a good deployment zone operates. And so take advantage of those positions when deploying your HVTs. The other reason for having at least some of your HVTs hug those table edges is that sheer distance tends to keep them safe. Your opponent will mostly start in their deployment zone and so have to cover a long distance to get to those parts of the table, although beware enemy infiltrators and parachutists. One mistake it can be easy to make is assume that the table corner is one of the best places to put things, but that is actually very, very close to where a hidden deployment infiltrator could be. So just kind of be aware of that risk. Usually as close to your deployment zone as possible, as close to the table edge as possible while being in full cover is one of the best places for HVTs. Similar to Akial Interference, the rules for deploying HVTs for each player are nominally the same but may want to be approached differently. If you can find one spot to cluster all of your HVTs and defend them really heavily, that can be good. But especially if you are the first player, be aware that that maximizes the second player's ability to counter deploy. If you put all of your HVTs in one table corner, for example, well, they could put one infiltrator down that can kill all of them, or one model with a deployable repeater that can then place that repeater, spotlight one, and guided missile all three. So just be a little careful about clumping them, especially as first player. In terms of first and second player, as first player, you kind of get to decide the pace the game will be played at. You get to decide if it will be mission or attrition focused. If you spend your first turn aggressively going after and killing the enemy, both players will probably spend the remainder of the game scrabbling to try and score objectives, which is totally fine. That could be a winning play. Or if you go after and you press a bunch of buttons early and you have a lot of flexibility to go and kill HVTs, that can set you up well as well. You've got a lot of agency as first player. As the second player, you have the console advantage. Remember that I said in a tied game, the tiebreaker is who has more consoles. It's the second player who has the last opportunity to press those buttons. That can be a deciding factor in both games. Secondly, you're the last player who can extend an offensive piece without fear of counterattack. A suicidal play to kill a designated target on turn 2 or turn 3 can be a suboptimal play to make if there's runtime left in the game, but as the second player in your third turn, there's no runtime left and there are no kill points in this scenario. It's just all about the HVTs. And because of the distance that you have to cover in this scenario, having a plan for going after and killing those HVTs is really worthwhile. Vehicles are really, really strong in this scenario, and I would just make the observation that I think everyone might have hated old unmasking if vehicles as they currently exist had existed at the time, because they're just tremendously powerful in this scenario. If you don't have vehicles, don't sweat that. You can make up for that with any high-quality fast attack piece, or infiltrators or parachutists. And in particular, if you have a few good quality like tactical awareness or 6/4 move or both, attack elements that can move around the table aggressively, and isn't a vehicle, well, good news, you've probably got a list there that's really good for Cutthroat. Provided that model is an irregular, not being a vehicle, but being a good rapid offensive unit, something like a Zeta, for example, or almost any tag, that's probably a good Cutthroat list kind of incidentally. But again, if you don't have that, don't sweat it. Infiltrators or parachutists, or frankly guided or spec fire, can be really valuable tools in this mission. Also, one little thing to note, or two little things to note. The first thing, not on the slide, but just kind of to be aware of, civivac is still a rule in this ITS. You are allowed to civivac your own civilians, and that does open up a kind of jammy line of play where you can civivac a civilian and run it all the way back into the corner of your deployment zone where it can't be killed. In my experience, this is very order intensive, particularly in radial scenarios, because by definition, you have to get to the civilian and civivac them and then cover like 28 inches of distance to get back into the corner of your table edge where you are maximally safe. It also tends to make people kind of angry when it happens, because while it's technically legal, it doesn't feel particularly in the spirit of the mission. I would note it is absolutely legal. It is just something that is maybe not as good as it always feels, because you will often be blowing out much of a turn to make that play. And a model that is in the back of your table edge, well, sure, they're pretty difficult to kill back corner of your deployment zone, but they aren't invulnerable. And there were probably already really good positions that were close to your deployment zone and far away from the enemy, but which don't require an entire turn of orders to relocate a civilian to accomplish. So bear in mind it is a play that exists. Sometimes it will be a winning play, but it's often, particularly in Radial Unmasking, where there tends to be a really maximal amount of good quality places to put HVTs, really not essential. I saw it a little bit more often in regular unmasking because it was kind of brutal trying to deploy HVTs on some tables in regular unmasking, so relocating them could be really valuable, not as necessary in Radial Unmasking. The final thing to note is that this is the only radial scenario in the pack, and it is the final round, which means that when everyone is setting up their table on round, like before round one, on the Friday beforehand, I'm sure they will think about radial deployment zones, but they will mostly be thinking about setting up tables for the first four scenarios. Borderbash has got really great tournament organizers, so if you get to your table and the deployment zones are just fucking cooked, just call a TO over and say, hey guys, can we just reorganize this a little bit? You are doing absolutely nothing wrong before rolling for lieutenant or selecting list, right? Before the game begins, if the deployment zones just look really grim and like they will give one player nowhere to hide or something like that, like the table just isn't set up for radial, just call a TO and get it sorted. Frankly, if you and your opponent are of like mind, you might even sort it with yourselves by each other. Lord knows I have done that in games in events of the past, but just don't feel like you have an onus to play a table that is not set up for the scenario. The TOs are your friends and they are there to make sure that you have a good time. So just keep that in back of mind. Radial deployment table setup is a little bit different to regular deployment table setup because it's played along a different axis, and you and your opponent will both want to have a good and fun table to play on. So just kind of bear that in mind. And that wraps up our run through all of the Borderbash scenarios. Just as a little recap, I've come all the way back to this slide, which was written after looking at all of the scenarios, to kind of remind people, hey, what are the through lines and how might we do list construction? And as we've seen, that second dot point there in particular, unmasking, superiority, and Akial Interference in particular are all scenarios that really like you being able to do a little bit of mission objective play every round, whether that be in Akial Interference, doing one classified around and then pivoting to aggression, or in unmasking, pressing one button around and then going and killing a HVT. And then, of course, in superiority, pressing buttons just as a side activity while you're fighting over those quadrants, and list construction that takes that into account can be really valuable. We also want to think about at faction selection particularly, good quality key operators and ability to kind of easily do classified objectives. And if you want a place to start, write a list for unmasking that can activate a console and kill a distant HVT each round, and then see what it can't do. If it can't do Akial, build for Akial. If it can't do Cutthroat, build for Cutthroat, and you've probably got a mission mix there that both of your lists can cover. It is a mission pack that in particular I think lightly favors factions that have access to high quality key operators, but which I do think any faction can do, and even a faction like Tartary Army Corps that most wants a good quality key operator that it just doesn't have access to for Cutthroat, has some particularly valuable lines of play in Cutthroat off the back of their really, really high quality defense. So I would expect to see a decent variety of factions at Borderbash, and I think we're at 30 players already with some pretty good variety in expected factions, so it should be a really good event. I actually don't know if I'm making it this year. Last year I couldn't. I was working in a job that just could not get time off at end of financial year. This year I am not working in a job that has a particular focus on end of financial year, but I just kicked off the new position 2 weeks ago, and I am busy all of the time forever. Even getting this video together was a little bit of a stretch, but it was a really good time and I'm glad to have recorded it. So may or may not be at Borderbash, but I have absolutely been preparing for it. Firstly, because it's fun to just think about and prepare for events and have that focus. And secondly, because this video was asked for. So Callum, again, thank you very much for your channel support and for requesting this video. For everyone else, as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by becoming a channel member or ongoing supporter on Buy Me a Coffee, or by making a one-off donation via Buy Me a Coffee. Big thanks to everyone who supports the channels. It allows me to keep making these videos. It is enormously appreciated. Quick note, probably no Infinity video next weekend, but I am hoping to have some content out in the week after, so keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, hope everyone has a good time, and we will see you shortly for our next Infinity video.